Good evening. I'm literally just going to introduce Yati and let him go, and then we probably have some time for questions afterwards, which we'll open to the floor. So, Yati Durant. Yati is an American-born composer. In a former life, maybe still a little bit, a jazz trumpeter. But that playing is, I think, very important to his compositional practice, and we'll hear a bit about that. In the mid-1990s, he lived and worked in New York, a career in TV and film, covering a range of things there. And he also studied later composition under Christoph Meyer and electronic composition under Hans-Ulrich Kumper. And also, I believe, in masterclass with under George Crumb, no less, which we may see some of that in his course there. Yati writes concert and film music, but it's about his film music that we're going to hear about today, and particularly about working with silent film. He scored a number of projects, some of which are available on DVD for purchase, if you like, including a project I believe we'll hear a bit about today, Babacha Potemkin, and some others, the Polish songs, The Vagabond, and von Morgen's Bis Mitternacht. And as John said, you heard that Yati has recently joined the staff at Edinburgh University, and one of his tasks there is setting up a new master's program specifically for film and TV composers. And because of his own interest as well as in performance and working with live ensembles, I believe he'll be setting up the University of Edinburgh Film Music Orchestra, which is a nice and interesting program. So we have the intriguing title, New Music in Silent Film, or vice versa. And we'll hear more about that.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Thank you. It's actually a real pleasure to be here. It's the first time I've actually been in this building. Very impressive.
It's so noisy as well. So enormous health education fair.
Well, it's a bold building, but we're going to, I guess it's appropriate that we're going to be talking about something silent when there's a lot of noise going on, which is actually a lot of what silent film music is all about, actually noise in silence, or vice versa. And the first thing that I want to address before I begin with the text that I prepared for today is sort of address the concept of why I entitled this silent music, new music in silent film, or vice versa. I want to show the factors that make silent film interesting for composers to compose to, and the necessity for silent films to have interesting experiments in music composition carried out. But hopefully it's a symbiotic relationship, and this is what I'm researching, what I'm doing creatively, and I want to talk a little bit about where that is going, what I've learned from it so far, and how I got there in the first place. So, without further ado, I'll just start with my prepared texts, and I hope that afterwards we can feel free, we're such a small group that we can feel free to ask questions, to talk about it, to discuss things. I'm very, very open to all types of dialogues. I trust there are a few here who have particular interest in silent film music, and I welcome you to speak to us and nurture the dialogue. And the way that I want to begin this seminar, actually, is to begin with actually a very interesting and for me very inspiring quote from the great German composer and film composer Hans Eisler. He said, "Music has a magic effect against the ghostliness of silent film." This quote by Hans Eisler is part of his theory of establishment of music in film. Why should there be music in film? Clearly, since Eisler was most active during the early days of cinema, his impression of film without music was different than ours today. An early reel of music, especially during the silent film era, flickered, it had rough edges, sometimes suffered from motion artifacts and ghosting. And most of all, unless you were in a grand theater back then, the constant drone and clicking of the projector was your only sonic companion during that pantomimic era. it is completely understandable that he would consider that a ghostly experience. Especially for the early film composer, that sensation must have been even more exaggerated. The film composer back then was often only improvised to the films, which in comparison to releases of our day, extremely polished, grand releases, were flooding through the cinemas in a torrent of new releases: adventure, romance, comedy, drama, and science fiction each week. There was simply no time or budget for much consideration regarding music. Nevertheless, with some of the early films, they had the foresight and luxury to approach real composers of modern music of the day for dramatic support through music. One of the first marriages between film and new music occurred with Camille Saint-Saëns, I'm very bad at French actually, L'assassinat du Duc de Guise, in 1908, and I'll show you actually a little fragment of this piece. You can note that actually what we see is a lot of repetition, practically ostinato in the bass. And in comparison with film music nowadays, it actually shows quite a bit of similarity, I guess, in the design in which film music is produced nowadays. A lot of ostinato, a lot of repetition, a lot of simplistic motives, that kind of stuff. Arguably, this could hardly be called new music, in the sense that it did not necessarily push conventional borders of musical development at the time. Rather, it almost framed a convention to be by utilizing now film music cliché repetitions, ostinati, and other devices. However, the real question is, how could newly composed, truly composed music and film correlate with each other? Coming back to Hans Eisler, one of the most interesting experiments of new music to film occurred between Hans Eisler and the Rockefeller Foundation. Interestingly enough, this fusion occurred in the US, a condition of a new culture seeking a music identity, a new musical identity perhaps, with good funding and an open mind, something that we don't often see there right now. So I'd like to read a bit from the Rockefeller project. Between 1940 and 1942, Eisler conducted a research project with funds from the New York Rockefeller Foundation, which resulted in a kind of art fugue of film music. This demonstrated not only the suitability of film to film of new musical material and the range of its functions, but it also provided sound concepts for logically consistent musical forms, including but not limited to canonic formal types in film, which in turn made the adaptation of this music as concert works possible. Among these later were the Camera Symphony, which means chamber symphony in English, of 1940, which includes the use of electronic instruments and using the same instrumentation as Schoenberg's Perrault Lunaire. The quintet 14 Arten, den Regen zu beschreiben, 14 Ways to Describe Rain, Opus 70. Both of these being 12-tone chamber music works, which count amongst Eisler's most complex and advanced compositions. Their filmic relationship to the documentary White Flood and Joris Iden's film study Regen, Rain, is explained in the book Composing for Films, Komponieren für den Film, co-written with Adorno. So I would like to show a few small, tiny clips. Actually, these are internet quality. For rights purposes, they were the ones that are available. From Hans Eisler's experimentation with film and music. So we can just look at it. Whoops. I believe I've lost the mouse. There we go.
wood stone.
We can look at one final clip here. I've got them all in the correct order.
The world wears everywhere the marks of its own history. In the glacial fjords of the Arctic lie vestiges of the great winter. There, we still may read the laws and movements of the mysterious ice.
One of the most striking and unusual aspects of this project was that this music was sometimes written before and regardless of the film material it was supposed to coexist with. That represents a sort of artistic ideal that is certainly not realistic to realize within our highly commercial film business of today. For example, there is a legend that Arnold Schoenberg, a renowned German expatriate teacher of composition in Los Angeles during the Second World War and grandfather of the New Music movement, was once asked by a Hollywood producer if he would be interested in composing a score to a film there. And I'll read a little bit from this very humorous story. Several famous European composers migrated to California and to escape the political climate of the Nazi era. Among them was Arnold Schoenberg, who spent the remainder of his life in Los Angeles, where he was avidly sought after as a teacher by many of the movie composers. Schoenberg showed no interest in film music, although his fame was such that a few producers thought it might be wise to get his name on a picture. One of them was the young, shrewd, and successful Irving Thalberg. In 1937, Thalberg asked Schoenberg to come to MGM to discuss the scoring of The Good Earth. He was told by the producer that his film version of the Pearl Buck book was one of the studio's most artistic efforts and presented a rare opportunity for a composer. Thalberg described one scene. There's a terrific storm going on. The wheat fields are swaying in the wind, and suddenly the earth begins to tremble. Then, in the earthquake, the girl gives birth to a baby. What an opportunity for music. Schoenberg looked at him incredulously. With so much going on, what do you need music for? Thalberg was puzzled by this apparent lack of interest. He then asked Schoenberg, what would be your terms in working for us? Replied the composer, I will write the music, and then you will make a motion picture to correspond with it. Neither Thalberg nor any other producer approached Schoenberg again. Obviously, Hollywood would not do something like this, and it was no wonder that Schoenberg was not considered for any projects again despite his fame and prominent status as a composer. So now I'd like to shift onto my own experience with silent film and new music. It has been silent film composition that has been one of my creative focuses over the last several years, and it's certainly for this interest that I am invited here to speak today. I thought it would be appropriate first to introduce my academic and creative background as they relate to my compositions for silent film. As a composer and electronic composer, I studied in Cologne at the Hochschule für Musik for many years. As a film composer, I was involved in many projects ranging from professional TV and film projects prior to my living in Cologne. Prior to my living in Cologne, I was very active in the States, particularly in New York in the 90s, as a TV composer and gigging jazz musician. Yeah, I'm still a jazz musician in some capacity. I came to Cologne on accident, meeting my future composition professor and mentor, Krzysztof Meyer, and therefore deciding to address my apparent compositional faults by intensely beginning studies in modern composition there. Intensely beginning studies in modern European composition. What I mean by that is the kind of composition studies that we do not easily understand in the States. As a student, I felt I made film and TV music primarily as a way to make money, but I also felt that there may be much creative potential in the genre, particularly as at the time I was inundated with new compositional possibilities stemming from my studies. From projects to word of mouth, at the end of my Meisterklasse concert exam studies, I was offered a composition commission from the Hochschule and the Stadt Köln, the city of Cologne, to compose music to the newly released and uncensored version of the battleship Potemkin. Even though I had never composed for the demanding genre of silent film music, I felt it was a great opportunity to explore how far I could take film music and still have it pertain to the film, both dramatically and compositionally, and not just because it was convenient that the director was actually dead. Question: does film music provide enough challenge for a composer creatively? In short, I would tend to say no, and that's probably a very controversial answer. It usually does not provide enough creative challenge and tends to throttle creative output. Perhaps this is partially due to the ineffective director, producer, composer collaborations, but it's likely more due to the relatively conservative and change-unfriendly film consumer market. I felt that may not have been the case with Potemkin. So with compositional gusto, I jumped into making a challenging but appropriate score to the recently uncensored and restored Potemkin. As the film was so famous, I was slightly cautious compositionally, but I did end up using many advanced new music techniques in its creation. And I can show you actually some fragments from the score. Here's a fragment from the 5th act, where I was using, this is actually for large orchestra, and I was using some modern techniques such as frame composition, extended glissando techniques, non-metric scoring, this kind of stuff. It became actually quite useful for a couple of reasons. One of them was that it had a dynamic, dramatic effect. The other was that in silent film music, it's absolutely vital that you put in some elements of buffer, just in case something goes wrong. Because unlike scoring for other films or scene-based films, as in the case of Potemkin, for example, the film is 72 minutes long. It starts and it doesn't stop, so you have to have a lot of contingency plans into place built into your score. So I was using some modern techniques for those reasons, and also for the fact that they sounded actually very interesting and dynamic. So now I'll show you actually a portion from, I'll show you two small scenes from Potemkin. Maybe we'll actually want to dim the lights a bit. I'll show you a portion from the 3rd act, which goes into the famous stair-step scene, and then a portion of the 5th act, utilizing some of the merit between electronics and acoustic instruments. These are live recordings directly taken from microphones. They're not recorded later. So that's a portion of the stair-step scene. It goes on a bit. And then I'll show you another contrasting scene from the fifth act, which is the next act. I'm sorry, would it help if I give you just a little background about what's happening in the film? Just a tiny bit. After the Tsarist troops opened fire on the citizens of Odessa, the battleship, which had recently mutineered, decides to face the oncoming fleet of Tsarist ships, and it's an absolute suicide mission, but they're heroically believing in the cause. So this is at the moment in which the sailors on the Potemkin first see the fleet of oncoming Tsarist ships and are getting all preparations ready for what would probably be an absolute slaughter. Of course, it ends actually different than that. I can just add also, it's the performance was actually done in surround sound electronics. We had a concert hall in Cologne that's actually a large concert hall, fits about 800 people, and it's completely surround controllable. So I had prepared actually all of the sound effects in quadraphonic sound. So you had actually the movement of the ships coming in different directions, and there was a spatial effect that was happening at the same time. So it's difficult to sort of compress all the sound onto 2 small channels, especially in a compressed format like Dolby Digital, and get the same effect as actually being there. But essentially you can see there's a lot of things to coordinate, a lot of things to take care of. We had extreme complex difficulties in trying to coordinate the electronics in with the film together and the orchestra all together. I can talk about that a little bit afterwards, definitely, if anyone has any questions about it. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Van Morgen's Besmittenacht, my recent project as well, my new challenge. Van Morgen's Besmittenacht, which means from morn till midnight in English, was a project that came out of my experience with Battleship Potemkin, and later from Ernst Lubitsch's Lady Windermere's Fan, a project that I had done in 2008. The actual project was at first proposed by myself in the beginning of 2009 to be a new score for the comedic silent film Grandma's Boy. However, my collaborator Daniel Kottenscholter felt that my compositional skills were better suited for a more intense and ambitious project. Apparently, he knew in advance about a restoration by Stefan Drossler at the Film Museum in Munich of the previously lost silent film Van Morgen's Besmittenacht. The film has actually a very interesting history. It was actually, it never was released officially. It's from the same director as Das Kabinett des Dr. Kiligari, and the film was never released and ended up being sold to a Japanese collector who was showing it for a number of years in kabuki theaters. And was recently discovered and also restored. But because it was never released, there was never actually any proper music for it. Together at the Berlinale in February 2009, we suggested to Stefan Drossler about the eventuality that I also create a definitive score to the film. Both the Kölner Philharmonie, the Cologne Philharmonic, and Michael Aust of the Soundtrack Cologne found the idea equally interesting, and they agreed to support it. The composition was played live to film at the keynote in Museum Ludwig on November 20th, 2009, and I conducted and rehearsed the ensemble myself. Composing to such a serious silent film combines the artistic challenges of composing a vast serial music score, 72 minutes, non-stop, with the pressures of matching everything else live to a fixed motion picture. It's especially difficult in that the cinema, that everything keeps going even if you make a mistake. On top of that, it's dark, and financing enough time to rehearse properly is nearly impossible. The recordings that I've shown you are all live takes, actually first takes, and they're not edited in any way except for Potemkin, which had 2 performances. But that was merely just a cut in the middle. There was no actually stolen fragments from other takes. So when I compose the score to such a film, I make sure that the parts, including cues and everything, are as clear as humanly possible. That's absolutely vital. Everything has to work correctly. Even then, musicians are human, and I am too. So we had to be prepared for all types of emergency situations. In fact, during the rehearsals, we spent probably a good portion, maybe a third of the time, just talking about contingency situations. Should something go absolutely and completely wrong, where do we meet up and how do we catch each other? Which is vital, and it further cuts into the necessity of actually rehearsing particular musical fragments. I began such a project by watching the film a couple of times. Then I map out a cue sheet, and a cue sheet is actually all of the cue elements that I definitely want to be meeting or hitting or emphasizing in the music, and a particular time code. In this case, it's called Sinti time code, which is actually a time that's written below it when I'm working on a working copy. Then I write it down, and there's the cue. That way I know when it's coming up exactly. In the case of these films, I think in Van Morgen's Besmittenacht, the cue sheet was about 40 pages. So it's very, very, very extensive, and it's sort of researching the film many, many, many times. In my previous silent film compositions, I spared some time composing by adding electronic atmospheres and music to the film. Like in Potemkin, there are sections that are actually entirely electronic for a couple of minutes, mainly used as places that the orchestra can rest before preparing for the next section. 72 minutes is a long time for an ensemble to play, especially if you're a brass player. And that's where electronics come in handy. But in Van Morgens bis Mitternachts, there were no electronics. A couple of reasons for that. Because electronics usually require synchronization, and therefore the film must be digitized in order to synchronize it. With Panzerkreuz Potemkin, Battleship Potemkin, we had a sponsor that did this for us, including projecting it in a HD version of the film at the premiere. But for this film, there was no budget or time for that. And I must also say that I prefer the quality of the actual 35mm film, so it was okay with me. But it just meant that all the music had to be composed on paper, and the poor musicians didn't have so many breaks. At first I composed a suite of about 15 minutes, in which almost all of the motives are representative. I can show you actually a fragment of it. This is actually for just two instruments, happen to be harpsichord and violin. And this is one particular motive that I had used, and I think there were about 10 or 12 of those, and each of them were 50 to 60 measures long and had a few different ideas in them. Then I started to mentally place those motives in the film. Since there were many vacant holes between the sections, I then began to consider how the ideas could be expanded. In some way, it was like culturing something. I had actually placed these sections in important fragments, important cues of the film, and then I expanded them in all directions to meet each other. Sometimes the motives are repeated, but almost never in the exact same way. That way the work doesn't ever get boring. And I'll show you actually the same section, actually when it's scored at the beginning, scored for the entire ensemble. You can see the same motives are placed, but orchestrated just a bit. So. The composition is constructed like the film in 5 acts. Potemkin is also in 5 acts. It has many fast and slow passages, some tutti and some solo. The drama is strongly attached with the drama in the film. The ensemble developed out of my friendship with the violinist Justina Nischnik and the harpsichordist Marka Dotkus. That's why actually the original piece was actually for Baroque violin and harpsichord, because that was those two particular instrumentalists. We performed 2 silent film scores of mine at the Strada del Cinema Silent Film Festival in Aosta, Italy, in August 2009. I had written for harpsichord before, but after this summer my interest in the instrument was renewed. Furthermore, I think the sound of the harpsichord is timeless and very interesting to any audience. So I had to build a semi-balanced ensemble around this extraordinary instrument. Also, I had to think about the colors of sounds I would need when composing to this film. For example, I thought that one character, the bank manager, for example, sounded exactly like a bassoon in my head, so I had to get one. It was almost like a leitmotif type of instrumentation. Clarinet is a very flexible and useful instrument. One of my best colleagues plays clarinet, and that one is definitely a keeper in practically every project. Percussion gave the ensemble a lot of dynamics and tempo. The other instruments were horn, the French horn, and cello, which I thought balanced the ensemble. 7 musicians were all the modest budget could afford. Conducting the ensemble to the silent film is about the most challenging type of conducting that I know about. And the score had many, many written cues for the conductor within the score. You can see just a couple here up above. Those are just the first 2 cues. But those, in this case, I had no time code markings. I did them all visually, meaning that I saw them, recognized them, practiced them in their particular tempos. I visually had to check those musical passages and prepare for direct cues. I did not use any streamers or click tracks or other devices. My score had additional complications that included aleatoric improvised passages with special cues for the ensemble, a little bit like what I had done in Potemkin, and here are a few of them. I'll show you them. This way I could give an instrument or certain instruments a few notes or a phrase to repeat and or improvise with, and I called it setting them free, until I gave them a cue to return to the ensemble parts. In theory, this makes this music easier to play, more organic and spontaneous. In practice, however, it is really quite challenging to coordinate, especially for the conductor. You can see that actually, these are some aleatory passages where I gave these instruments, for example, something to repeat indefinitely until they received another cue to move on. And there was no time involved whatsoever. These cues very often correlated directly to a cue that's written in the score. And it gave them almost like a little rest from having to count. And they enjoyed that, I think they did. So I've got actually two sections of Von Morgen's Mismitternachts that I'd like to show you. Part of it is from Act 1, the end of Act 1. The story from Von Morgen's Mismitternachts, from morning till evening, it's actually a chronological story. It starts in the morning, obviously, and goes until midnight. It's about a bank director who is tempted by a beautiful woman one day while working in the bank and decides to steal all the money in the bank and go and try to convince her to run away with him, to work with him. And she looks at him and says, "You're crazy." And then he realizes he's a criminal and he starts to run and escape from his own life. In this case, he goes to the city and ends up spending all of the money in an entire evening. And there's a tragic ending. I'll show you a bit of it. This is actually the destiny figure in Von Morgen's Mismitternachts. First act. You can leave the lights out, actually, and I'll show you a portion of the final act when he's trying to redeem himself, but actually sees the three ghosts of his past, present, and future, not in the Dickinson way, but actually in a sort of tragic, I guess Stevenson is also quite tragic. In any case, this is his final try at redemption. very much. That's my presentation. And I'm very much looking forward to any questions, should you have any.
Thank you, Yati. Maybe I'll start to get the ball rolling. You made a provocative statement, and it was deliberately provocative, which is that film, you believe, did not provide enough creative challenge for a proposal. I wonder if you might go into a little bit more detail about why that's the case, or your experience of it. Is that the case with silent film, or you're just talking about in terms of certain kinds of industrial product, and how you might see a way out of that, for example?
Well, there are certainly a lot of different ways, and I'm sure that statement wouldn't be the same for everyone, but it is for me. And some of the limitations that I find are actually quite restricting. The biggest limitation that I think that I find with visuals, which is actually difficult to overcome, is the fact that they tend to distract from the listening experience. No matter how effective they are, how well they fit, there's always the tendency that the visuals will end up creating, will maybe neutralize some of the intimate effect, I think, of music when it's shown to screen. That could be even, doesn't even have to be a film. It could actually be just, for example, just like a screensaver or something like that. It would have already the effect of distracting something. So you're sort of fighting against the tide in that way. The other factors are more industry related, definitely. The constant battle for the necessity and the avoidance of cliches being probably the most important among them. And secondly, that very seldom is music thought of from the absolute beginning of a film project. Not in the sense that, for example, Schoenberg wanted to have a piece of music that was written and then a film written over it, and that's what Hans Eisler tried to show, but mostly because there's a certain type of form, musical form, a type of tempo, a type of development that occurs in music that is sometimes difficult for film to recreate, or simply hasn't been thought of. At least that's my experience.
I wonder if we might have some thoughts on how to respond to that, but particular point.
Well, I mean, I felt I was suffering from this problem of visuals over sound. You know, it's just very difficult to get around, because I was fascinated by your music, but I was constantly, you know, sort of hearing your music through the image. It's very difficult.
I mean, to be equally provocative, I suppose I have to put the question the other way, which is why work with film at all? If it's a hindrance, if it's getting in the way, and you want people to hear music and not be distracted by those images.
Mm-hmm. It's just extremely attractive to us, the combination of visuals and auditory. I think the genre has enormous potential because it's, whereas music has a lot of power, I think that visuals almost pull us into it in some way. True, it can be distracting and vice versa. Music could be distracting or the visuals can be distracting. But together, if it was possible to create a perfect marriage of the two, the force would be extraordinary, I think, and it's something to strive for.
Did you try to design the movie yourself in a way that fits with the design you're talking about?
Bees, for example? Or have I tried to make the movie myself?
To make the video yourself, the film yourself, so
Yeah.
that it fits with these exigencies. That
Yeah,
you're
I'm thinking
talking
about Mauricio Carval's film about Beethoven, for example, which is exquisite. Perhaps it's just not my talent. I completely respect, actually, the necessity for filmmakers to be experts in what they do, it doesn't really make sense that I would do it as well. It might dilute the entire experience. I mean, Mauricio Carval's films are great and fantastic. They're not mainstream, and they're definitely for a select audience, but a good example of that, definitely.
So are you attracted towards silent cinema because there's less diegetic noise to distract from your music?
Potentially, yes. I mean, the fact that there is no noise in it, that everything is created, sound effects, symbolism, sound design, all of these kind of things is a challenge. it's an interesting challenge to try to do it. It's not the only reason why it's interesting. I think that it's possible, and what I'm discovering is that actually through in the era of silent cinema, it's possible that the entire process was slightly more musical, or at least more related to the musical experience. In the case of these two films, for example, they're all 5-act films, something you'd hardly imagine to see in a film nowadays. They have very clear dramatic developments. The visuals are exaggerated in a way that is symbolic rather than, for example, realistic, which just really makes it a pleasure actually to score. I mean, there are definitely situations that are not so easy to score. For example, Potemkin, there's an 8-minute battle scene, which is one of the most difficult things, I think, to compose to, is these long scenes of extended violence. The stair-step scene being sort of an exception because of the incredible cinematography. But doing something like on the Trojan War or something like that must be extremely difficult to score, because you're having difficulty keeping that momentum going, simply so. Whereas in silent film, everything is exaggerated and it's extended and it fits nicely with musical devices.
I mean, you're talking there about one of the greatest scenes in all cinema, really, the Odessa Steps, of course. I'm wondering about, you're not the first person, or indeed the last to score Battleship Potemkin. I'm wondering where you are of, or you were of, for example, the Edmund Meisel version of it, or the Shostakovich versions, and how influential that is in the way you think about it, particularly a really tough sequence like that, motorically, rhythmically.
That was actually a question that was asked to me by quite a few people, including my former professors. Why do it? It's been so famously done before. Well, on the practical side, there's a couple of reasons. The most famous versions being Meisel's German version of it in 1925, and the Shostakovich reconstruction. Both of those have some faulty characters to them. First of all, the Meisel version and, well, actually the later version. I studied them all, actually, and listened to them, and I watched the film silently, and I tried to address them. The Meisel version was done to a censored version that doesn't fit anymore. So any version that's actually, the new version that came out is actually reconstructed, and it's even sort of slightly more faulty. It was actually done under extreme time pressure. He wrote it in 12 days. There's a lot of missed symbolism, and I think that he didn't take many risks to avoid defeating the censors, or, for example, any type of perpetuated symbolism. Whereas now you're sort of allowed to do it. I didn't hesitate to use, for example, the Russian national anthem, a lot of Ukrainian national melodies that I used as fragments, some musical symbolism also in it as well. Hopefully it had a sort of a stronger effect. Not to say that Meisel's music wasn't great. In the stair-step sequence, for example, Meisel's was probably a little bit more in my direction, whereas Shostakovich's version, first of all, it has to be said, Shostakovich had nothing to do with the scoring of the film. He didn't even know it was done. He didn't permit it to be done. These are just edited fragments from his symphonies, which are extremely appropriate, and they sound fantastic. But then the symphonies themselves sound amazingly good. What is good about that one, for example, in the stair-step scene, is that it has a deeper sorrow to it. It's actually not as violent. So in that effect, I listened to them. I tried to figure out how valid they were in their own particular ways, and I realized that I had to do my own thing. It just sort of came out that way.
How should I put this? Within the sort of Austro-German and then serial tradition, aesthetic tradition, one of the great watchwords is integrity, unity. Do you feel that the film, working with film, is a liberation from that? Rather than, I mean, one could see it as your role, you could feel compromised by the film. But on the other hand, it struck me you might actually feel liberated by the film.
In some ways, yes. It depends a lot on the film and actually its own particular integrity. Liberated. It depends on on, I guess, the mutual effect of the film and the music to work together, if it actually fit or not. In Van Morgen's Besmitternacht, I felt like the characters were actually liberating the music a bit, which was actually an interesting experience. You actually sort of don't know these things until it actually happens, you know, and then you actually recollect on them because you're so involved in the process. I hope that it would liberate the music and my experience making to the music. That's my ultimate goal, definitely. Something like that.
Yeah.
I'm not quite far enough to actually know where that would be possible in every case.
But the obvious place is in terms of structure.
Definitely.
Because that's the thing in the way that that's fixed and defined. You have to respond to that in some way, either against what you feel it's saying structurally. So certainly I found that it frees up, in my mind, a tendency towards certain kinds of structural practice, structural design, that might only work well in the film. Actually, if you take it away from it, then you notice some of those imbalances.
Sure. I mean, I think it's also important to note that this kind of music, people go to see these events and would experience the music in a different way than if they didn't have the film at all to see. Meaning that actually this is fairly high-risk music in a concert sense, but in a silent film sense, there are a lot of people who would perceive it and accept it as being valid. They wouldn't normally accept that particular music as being valid. Perhaps because they had the mutual experience of some help on the screen, or perhaps because they like the whole combination of it. It's actually, it supports, it gives you, I wouldn't quite say that it gives a certain amount of redundancy to the music, but it does sort of help emphasize the structure. Yeah. And like I said, a lot of this atonal, maybe aggressive, modern practices, you wouldn't really get away with it in a concert sense under normal circumstances. So perhaps it is liberating.
Have you? What do you think about inserting some explicitly, let's say, diegetic sounds within the music, like for instance voices, pitches? Maybe there is a telephone in the images, and you include the telephone ringing. I mean, these are thought as sounds.
I mean, I actually can't show you the entire film. So there are sections where that occurs, and there are some voices also. Sometimes they're suggested. Not just that, but in the score there are actually riddles in there too that I put in there because I thought it was fun. Some type of musical symbolisms that you could discover if you looked at the score. So yeah, I think it's definitely acceptable. The border to me is, when does it actually achieve cliché? That's what I'm trying. I try to avoid that. Not cliché.
I'm just thinking about what you were saying. Eisler, Kurt London, and others have said about the ghostiness of the cinematic science and experience. And if you start doing sound effects for one thing, a telephone ring, why not for everything else? There's a point where if you hear one thing, you have to have everything else. Otherwise, it's in between this world where it's music, in a way, separated from the image, but commenting on it. And there's something that bridges the gap. So it's a real challenge to choose what to do, if anything. And I mean, personally, I would err on the lesser side of the lesser. But
it's true. I mean, for example, in Potemkin, in the very first act, there's a scene where the sailors are actually sleeping, and one of the officers comes in and just, on a whim, whips the back of one of the sailors. And actually, in the score, I had them with it in synchronization with an actual orchestral clap, which was exactly right. And I can't quantify exactly the experience that everyone had, but I did sort of felt like it's made the illusion, the entire creative, visual, musical illusion freeze for a second, and sort of eliminated a little bit of momentum. So I don't know. I wouldn't exactly call it a mistake because it was effective, but it was curious.
Paul?
I was going to say that to some extent, sorry, I'm only hearing over one ear today, so I'm hearing everything I say twice. But to some extent, you don't. Your musical style is not turning its back on, to some extent, conventional ways of accompanying film. And the style, I think, fits those two sequences you played extremely well, particularly the German Expressionists. Was that Robert Wiener?
Exactly.
Yeah. And I'm wondering how far you feel you could take your own musical style towards other types of film. I mean, maybe something like a Buster Keaton comedy. Wouldn't you feel you're coming up against a collision of values in your own music and style that may prevent you going in that direction?
I've tried it. In 2009 in Aosta, I did Chaplin's The Vagabond. And actually in May in Edinburgh, my film music orchestra is also going to be performing an arrangement of my Vagabond by a larger ensemble by the orchestra. So we're going to try it again. So that's a Chaplin comedic film. I found it terribly difficult to do, and I was happy to try it because I wanted to answer that exact same question. In 2008, I also did Lady Windermere's Fan, sort of a gentrified comedy by Oscar Wilde, and it was also an experiment on how the problem is that these examples seem very heavy, perhaps very intense, and could my style also be lightened up? I can't really answer that question how well I did, but I tried it.
I think I was also thinking of a sort of wider issue in this area. If Kevin Brownlow and Carl Davis were in the room, they'd probably think of as a compliment to this period of films being what they might think of as authentic compliments, which would be using music that was deliberately cliche. Do you have any? Do you feel that division in this kind of this area of work as an issue?
It's a bit difficult to say what is cliche for silent film. The era is past, and we're kind of slightly unfamiliar with the genre, at least the public is. So then cliche could take a number of factors. It could be ironic, it could be appropriate. I think more important is it interesting, actually, and then does it fit actually a particular cliche? Not to mention also that within a film itself, the music itself can create its own cliches through leitmotifs, for example, too aggressive use of leitmotifs. So then I'm also consciously a bit trying to avoid that mental thought, but trying to find the effectiveness of it as well, because all of these films actually do use leitmotif technique. They may not be perfect leitmotif technique, it might not be strict leitmotif technique in a way that I'm just mimicking, I'm just basically copying everything and pasting it. Everything's slightly varied, but the musical memory side of it I'm trying to use.
I really enjoyed your talk, thank you. I'm myself not a musician, I'm actually a public health person, but I came along out of interest. And so what I'm interested in, from your point of view as a composer, when you're composing for screen, is your primary focus to interpret what you think the director wants to interpret, or give your interpretation of what you have in front of you, or create something entirely new without the audience primarily in mind, just to give them a new experience? I just wonder, what's your...
Well, of course, in silent film that's not possible, because the director is, in this case, long since dead. And I don't think that even in a living situation that it's very easy to answer. Essentially what we try to understand as composers working in projects is how can we learn to communicate and collaborate together with a director or a producer who's ever responsible for the musical decisions. And at the same time, potentially feel artistically satisfied. I'm sure there are situations where that's not possible. For example, if there's a lot of money involved, or for example, we agree that it's not necessary to create a court art style film. I won't lie to you to say that actually a silent film project is liberating in that sense, that you just don't have to collaborate. But you do have an urge to sort of study what you think they might have wished for, or what would have been appropriate in this circumstance, so that it's not just a completely rebellious activity, and also so that it's appropriate, because ultimately, if you don't understand what the filmmaker has been portraying, then you won't have the ability to represent it musically.
Sorry. I was just wondering, you mentioned, that performers to play constantly for 72 minutes is a really difficult task, but what musically would you think about sort of just, perhaps even through a band scene or something, just having silence? Would you think that effective, or, because that could really sort of blow somebody's mind, some complete silence through something really dramatic?
It's absolutely effective. Silence is sometimes even more effective than fortissimo. Saboteur, the final scene of Saboteur, Hitchcock, 1942. The most dramatic scene in the film. It's absolutely silent, except for wind and some birds and so on. And it's extremely effective. Sometimes anything is too much, and that's important to sort of see. I made sort of an experiment with my son, actually, who was 4 years old. He was watching Mickey Mouse. I really shouldn't have shown it to him, early Mickey Mouse, because it's actually for adults. You don't know about this because you just remember that. But there was a scene where Mickey and Donald are falling down a hillside, and they're just about to get smashed by a train that's coming at the same time. And there's all of this comedic Mickey Mousing, right, that's happening constantly. And the scene is so incredibly dramatic because you see this train coming in at such a speed, and you see the camper that they're in flying towards imminent doom, that mercifully Walt Disney, for a few seconds, put nothing there, because I was watching my son watch this, and he was pegged to the chair in fear, anticipation, everything possible. And so in that case, if there was, for example, the appropriate dramatic music, it might have gone way over the top and created a sort of a destructive atmosphere. So then silence was necessary. So it can be effective, and it can also be released. I mean, it's definitely, I'm sure you can agree, music is actually, they say, the space in between the notes. So silence is vital. Hopefully we can recognize that when we're scoring.
I was also, just in terms of silent film, it's sort of even more sort of shocking, because there's no dialogue going on. There is dialogue. I'm not sure what's going on, so it would be, it would really give that space, I suppose.
It's difficult to know exactly when to use that, but
Yeah.
definitely it's a good observation. It's vital to use silence.
I think the thing in silent film is that it's, as you're suggesting, it's very much more noticeable and consequently more painful in a way. The absence there is really lost. I did a thing several years ago with students who scored bits from Metropolis, and they did a live performance, and a student finished early, horribly early. The score went wrong, but it was the most shocking version of it, because there was just 40 seconds of silence at the end of this sequence with the audience going, is something going to happen, is it not going to happen? So a mistake that sort of worked in narratively, dramatically in their favour in that instance. So whether you can orchestrate that and manage it is difficult.
In the early silent film cinemas in France, the turn of the century, at least I've read that they had no scoring. They weren't scoring to the film at all. They were just literally playing music to the film, and they were booked for 2 or 3 hours or whatever. And after that, they go home, and sometimes that was in the middle of the film. That actually was commonplace.
You can see that if you look at the Lumiere screenings, the Littorio cinema. It lists pianist, compositor, and it lists the pieces they're playing. So there'll be a bit of Lumiere film and this Beethoven and this thing and that thing and this one, and almost with complete disregard for what might be happening to the film. So there was certainly a lot of by our standards, dodgy sort of scoring practice back in the teens and 20s.
The idea of music as a counter-attraction to the film.
Exactly.
You're playing your favourite Mozart sonata regardless of
Regardless of what's going on, yes.
But also, if you've got a list of what was played, you could presumably attach notional timings to the total length of the music compared to the total length of the film and get some sense of where actually there was maybe complete, not a disconnection, but nothing.
Yes.
At all.
Well, and there were also, of course, compilation scores where people were, here's the kind of thing we suggest, we'd like you to play a bit of this and a bit of that. And you can kind of recreate them, but they never really work very well, actually. I don't know quite why that is, but maybe they didn't work very well back then.
Yeah. I think I remember hearing that in Berlin in the 40s there was the Centrum for Musicalische Research, so it's similar, I guess, Center for Musical Research. They tried to exactly answer that question scientifically in the way the Germans do, that they try to create a factor that is just undeniably, yes or no, on how effective music is in a film. And what they had come up with in the end was that it's actually not very effective at all. At the same time, they also had sort of fairly inconclusive results.
Well, thanks.
That's what was come up. Although this research, I don't know if you can find it anywhere. Okay. Probably burned, and who knows.
You said that you worked really closely with the film while you were composing. Is that something that composers who are composing or arranging scores for these films when they were first produced would have been able to do? And how,
very seldom.
And how close do you think your compositional process would be to how it was sort of back in the 20s and 30s?
Well, I had much more time than they did, no doubt. I think that situations like this are very rare, that there were actual scores that were given a good deal of time to compose and rehearse and perform. Back then, they were the example of Miguel was that he actually had only 12 days to do it. So I think with Metropolis, though, it was much more liberal. But there's just a handful of films that actually were properly scored in that sense. You can just imagine the cost, actually, because now I suppose we have a different priority to looking silent film in perhaps a classical way, that it's an artistic experience or a cultural experience. Back then, it was just whether it made money or not. I believe that's mostly the word.
Different. But the difference is that you, of course, can watch the film again and again and again.
Certainly.
You can look over a sequence again. And if you're a digitized version, you can have it in your computer if you're working in that way or whatever. To watch a film in 1920, whatever, involves quite a lot of effort to even see it once.
I mean, Miguel, I think he did. I did read about how he had done it, and he watched it, I think, once. And he just was scribbling notes as fast as he possibly could.
Yeah.
I mean, Max Steiner, for example, was a composer that was a little bit different, right? He actually had access to the film reels and was cutting them and marking them. He was the first one to use some techniques to help him synchronize, where he was actually mathematically, you remember, he was actually mathematically measuring the length of film and creating some specific stuff, but I think before then it was just, you're lucky if you had a stopwatch.
So presumably that would have affected how close the relationship was between what was going on in music and what was going on in film.
Yeah, it makes it much more difficult, incredibly more difficult. In my case, many cues are exactly to the second, even less than a second, but exactly, hopefully right. And if you're aiming for that kind of perfection by seeing it once, I just can't imagine that's possible. So then in that way, answering your question, am I composing like they did back then? No, I'm not. Actually, I'm not.
But there is a place where that's happening back in that period, which is, of course, in your local cinema with your little band who are playing film. And the first time they see it, they're busking, but they're doing it for a week. And by the end of the week, they've got a pretty good idea. It's just that that's an improvising, live composing ensemble. We're starting from the point of assuming that the composer sits down and goes to their garret and has a glass of wine and thinks in that kind of way, as opposed to something more earthy and physical, which is another way of going about this.
Right.
Can I ask something to do with this? Well, before you said that there were some European musical composition studies that are not understood by Americans or something like that. I was wondering which one they are.
That's a very long answer. I grew up in the States, and for us, we're so far from European tradition. I grew up in the West Coast, even Northwest, Pacific Northwest, in Oregon. So the experience of reading it in books and listening to recordings, and in contrast, actually being here is completely different. Certain sort of Germanic things that I learned definitely influenced me as well, like the types of functional analysis over Roman numerals and things like this, and certain methods that were used to analyze and to discover music, and also just, I think most of all, just the complete immersion in music as being a vital way of learning is also important. It's impossible to say it actually in a short amount of time, but it's just very difficult to tell people back home where I come from exactly the difference between what you're listening, what people are doing here than what they're actually doing there. Not to say there aren't actually some interesting innovations, because in the Pacific, I guess this type of isolation also creates a sort of inventiveness and a sort of an offshoot, which is interesting to observe. But the tradition that we typically had, especially in the Central and East, in the Germanic and Austrian and Russian and Polish traditions, are sometimes very strict, actually, in comparison to the kind of musical education we have now. So everything influences you as a musician. Everything does, and that's just sometimes it just has to do with the sense of place, I think.
You mentioned that some of the passages in your scores are improvised. Am I right in thinking that sometimes with the silent films of time they were improvised too by a pianist?
Sometimes.
Well, with the improvisations you've written, I mean, are they done with musicians looking at the film, or are they done prior? And what does it mean? Are the musicians responding to the film in time?
Seldom, but occasionally. That's a big risk. Well, the way that is actually, I have photographs. I can even show you a little bit of what it looks like on the stage, at least the last one. If I can show you something there. The musicians are not facing the stage. And so having them look at, let's see, maybe I can show you, for example, a portion of, this is, for example, my ensemble when we were doing From Organs Besmittenas. They're not facing the stage. Sometimes I wrote in the cues things that they can actually turn around and watch, just because it's simpler for me to tell them to watch. Although you have to rehearse that, because it's just the most difficult thing is that the musicians have this tendency to want to turn around and watch the film, and then you can't. They're gone, and they can get lost very easily. I did occasionally tell the musicians, well, clarinet, French horn, for these 30 measures, you're allowed to turn around. But the fact is that almost all these musicians have never even seen the film. A couple of them I haven't even seen since then. They haven't even seen it ever. So,
it's a rubbish gig from the musician's point of view, because I don't get to see the films.
Sometimes, but using the word improvisation, it's a little bit of a stretch, because improvisation, what we sort of consider as improvisation, has a million different kind of connotations to it. When I was working with George Crumb, we had a lot of discussions about what is improvisation. He strongly felt that improvisation had no place in a modern composition, in the sense of just free improvisation, because that kind of ideal sort of doesn't exist. We're always affected by what we've learned and practiced and everything. So what is improvised is actually set in a framework within the compositions. I give them a little platform of tones that they use to improvise, or rhythmic structure they use to improvise, or technique, and I say, don't go out of this. And I sort of think, well, in any particular possibility, would that change the entire musical method? So they're not really improvising; they're just sort of halfway improvising.
Yeah, I once saw Henza, a percussionist, Henza piano percussionist here, both looking at the screen, and that was to Stroheim's Greed, and that was fully improvised right the way through, which was actually pretty good. Have you ever sort of do anything like that? Live improvisation with films?
I used to do that with another orchestra in the States, in Seattle, and it was good fun. Just difficult to control. It's very good fun, and if you have a good group of musicians, then perhaps you can achieve some very interesting things. It's just a completely different bag of, sometimes it's absolutely great. Actually, to tell you the honest truth, in the DVD, there are two versions of the audio. One of them is improvised by another ensemble, and one of them is mine. They're improvised. So I guess you could actually, by checking on the DVD, you can see if it worked by checking on both versions at the same time.
There's a tendency for some kind of improvisation like that to intensify cliche, isn't there? If everyone follows the same cue.
Okay, any questions or thoughts? I was just wondering about your representation of bankers as bassoons, and whether we might prefer at the moment a darker kind of instrument, perhaps. Thank you very much, Yati, for your presentation.
Thanks, it's a real pleasure.